6-year-old child who was hit by a Russian shell. He told a camera crew, "Show this to Putin." The outrage at that little girl's death, also the main story for The Telegraph. Fight for the innocents. The plight of children during this conflict also features on The Mirror. That same photo is on The Express with their headline, "Monstrous." The Mail contrasts with the humanity of its readers, who've raised over £1 million for the Ukrainian people, with what it insists is Vladimir Putin's inhumanity. And in a moment of incredibly rare levity, the Star shows what is purported to be a Ukrainian farmer attempting to tow a Russian tank off his land with his tractor. Now, if you want to see any of those front pages again, or indeed read the stories, then do scan the QR code on your screen right now. That will take you to the press review on the Sky News website. OK, let's tell you about some of the other developments regarding the crisis. Turkey says it will restrict some Russian warships from passing through the entrance to the Black Sea. Vessels from belligerent countries, it says, will only be allowed passage if they are returning to base. Ukraine has received a donation of Starlink satellite internet terminals from Elon Musk's SpaceX after coverage was disrupted by the Russian invasion. The terminals look like home satellite television dishes and can provide internet coverage by connecting to a fleet of satellites in low orbit. The Home Secretary Priti Patel has announced an extra 100,000 Ukrainians will be able to seek sanctuary in the UK, but she rejected demands to offer a full visa waiver, saying security checks must stay in place because of concerns about extremists and Russian agents. Well, a look at today's agenda right now and what's to come over Ukraine. At 7:15 our time, Mark Austin will get the latest assessment of the situation in Ukraine from the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab. Just after 8 o'clock, Mark will speak to Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey, while at 9:15 this morning, Boris Johnson is going to make a media statement with his Polish counterpart, Mateusz Morawiecki. You're watching the Early Rundown. Thank you for joining us this Tuesday morning. Coming up as Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters a 6th day, their sports teams are being shunned around the world. The details in a couple of minutes.
Look at that sheet of flame, and it's moving this way.
And over there is Dover.
We track the changes happening to our world right now.
I think it's a procession of the Taliban. There they are, right here.
Would you, as Prime Minister, be able to look them in the face?
Let's have a look at both of those two things.
I just want to say thank you for having the courage to speak to us.
We do genuinely believe in what we do, to show the truth.
I thought there was an astonishing story there. It was everything that a journalist might want in a story.
A story that you'd be proud to have filmed.
But they didn't want journalists to see the real story.
It was very tiring. It was very sad. It was very scary at times.
Hey, there's no need for this.
But you have to keep going.
Oh, look at that.
You don't want to lecture people, but you do have to give them the facts.
Hello again. FIFA have kicked Russia out of the World Cup. Our sports correspondent Tom Parmenter has more.
It was only 4 years ago that the biggest tournament in football landed in Russia. Vladimir Putin had reeled in the World Cup, and it was all very cozy with the president of FIFA, Gianni Infantino. Now, with nations lining up to refuse to play Russian teams, FIFA and UEFA have suspended them until further notice.
No, there was no other option. I mean, they should have done it 4 days ago, but they've finally seen sense, and the poodle has learned how to bark.
It means Russia's World Cup qualifiers are off next month.
Never giving in.
The Women's Euros in England this summer are a major doubt. And club side Spartak Moscow have been kicked out of the Europa League competition. Ukrainian athletes and footballers, unable to carry on with the sports they love, have led calls for complete bans for Russian sides. Shakhtar Donetsk in the east of Ukraine are just one club where some players have fled, others have stayed to take up arms and defend their country.
I personally think it's not enough. It's really not enough. And in my personal position, the Russia should be excluded from all sports international organizations.
Vladimir Putin also had the Winter Olympics in Sochi in 2014, where state-sponsored doping led to limited punishments. The Games go to Paris next in 2024. The IOC say Russian and Belarusian athletes should not be competing while their nations are at war. There's no doubt that Vladimir Putin has used and sometimes abused sport in his own interests. But even those who have fated him over the years, like FIFA and like the Olympic organisers, the outrage of the international sporting community has proved impossible to ignore.
Slava! Slava! Slava!
Players, fans, national associations, and now governing bodies have called it. There is no place for Russian sport when Ukrainian lives are being lost. Tom Parmenter, Sky News, Wembley.
Thanks for joining us on the early rundown. Mark Austin is
Назад, значит назад ушли, назад! Назад ушли!
Подоляк тут, так называемая.
good morning to you. This is Sky News Breakfast. It is 7 o'clock in the UK, 9 o'clock here in Kiev as Russian troops continue to advance towards this city. No let up, Russia launches airstrikes overnight on a military base on the edge of the capital here. Bearing down on Kiev, satellite images show a Russian military convoy stretching for 40 miles nearing this city. The International Criminal Court to investigate alleged war crimes in Ukraine as President Zelensky says Russian troops are intensifying the shelling. In New York, an unprecedented meeting of the UN General Assembly to discuss a resolution condemning Moscow's aggression. A growing refugee crisis as more than 500,000 people flee Ukraine. A diplomatic dash, Boris Johnson heads to Poland and Estonia, warning Vladimir Putin he'll feel the consequences for this invasion. Increasingly isolated, FIFA gives Russia the boot as more organizations turn their backs on Russia. We'll have the latest throughout the morning from here in the capital as Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters a 6th day. Good morning. A Russian convoy stretching about 40 miles is closing in on Kiev. President Putin has shown no sign of stopping the invasion of Ukraine, despite unprecedented sanctions and growing international isolation. And this morning, reports from a regional governor of the deaths of 70 Ukrainian servicemen in Russian shelling in the east of the country. These are the key developments today. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court plans to open an investigation into possible war crimes and crimes against humanity here. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has reported at least 102 civilian deaths, including 7 children. The true number could be much higher. The UN says more than 500,000 refugees have now fled Ukraine for neighboring countries. Ukraine's foreign minister says the United States has offered more support for his country in the form of sanctions and weapons. First this morning, Diana Magne has this report from Moscow.
A Russian airstrike on a military base at Brovary, northeast of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Drive quickly as they'll strike again, the man says, as flames light up the horizon. The Russians are closing in on the capital. These are the latest satellite images showing a huge convoy, almost 40 miles long, moving south towards Kiev. The convoy's tip just 15 miles from the center. And here, just to the west of the capital, the devastation from the weekend's fight. A bridge in the town of Bucha blown up, we're not sure by whom, and total destruction on the streets. Peace talks on Monday saw very little progress beyond a call to meet again. And with Russian helicopters pictured here positioned at the ready in Belarus, Ukraine's president called for the West to impose a no-fly zone over his country.
Evil, armed with missiles, bombs, artillery, must be stopped immediately. To destroy economically, to show that humanity is able to defend itself, I believe that the complete closure of the sky for Russian missiles, planes and helicopters should be considered.
In Kharkiv, close to the Russian border, evidence of the use of banned cluster bombs, shells which explode to release numerous little bomblets which scatter across a wider area. Russia appears to be ramping up its onslaught on Ukraine, with the resistance tougher than it may have bargained for, at a cost, no doubt, of more destruction to this sovereign land and its civilians. The International Criminal Court says it plans to open an investigation into potential war crimes carried out by Russia in Ukraine, leading up to and including the invasion. Neither Russia nor Ukraine are signatories to the ICC, but Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the court, which means the chief prosecutor can move forward. This as President Zelensky signed a document on Monday requesting immediate accession to the EU. An understandable course of action for him, red rag to a bull for Vladimir Putin. Diana Magne, Sky News, Moscow.
And we'll talk to Diana in just a moment. There's just been an update from the Ministry of Defence in London, who do these intelligence updates, and they're saying that the Russian advance on Kiev has made little progress over the past 24 hours, probably as a result of continuing logistical difficulties. Russian forces, they say, have increased their use of artillery north of Kiev and in vicinities of Kharkiv and Chernihiv. The use of heavy artillery in densely populated urban areas greatly increases the risk, says the MOD, of civilian casualties. Russia has failed to gain, this is interesting, gain control of the airspace over Ukraine, prompting a shift to night operations in an attempt to reduce their losses. That from the Ministry of Defense in London. Let's join Diana now, who is in Moscow. And Diana, is the sense now that Vladimir Putin is going to prosecute this invasion, prosecute this war to the end?
Well, I think that we haven't seen the full force of what Russia could bring in, and we haven't seen the kind of strategy that they've used in previous wars. And that may be for a number of reasons. That may be because the Kremlin completely miscalculated the kind of response they would get. They miscalculated the kind of resistance. They thought perhaps that the Ukrainians would be more pleased to see them. Perhaps they believed their own peacekeeping, liberating narrative. But that has certainly not played out in the way they expected on these first 5 days, and here we are on day 6, and we're beginning to see much heavier shelling. Perhaps we will see more deployment of the Air Force, because I was interested that the Ministry of Defense said they failed to gain control of the airspace. I'm not sure that Russia has really put its full force of its air power into operation. But if you think back to their intervention in Syria, we saw sustained Russian airstrikes of Syrian cities, which were indiscriminate, caused huge civilian loss of life. I think we may begin to see that kind of strategy take place in Ukraine too. And perhaps it was because they still wanted to sell to their own people the narrative that they were going in as liberators, as defenders, that they didn't go in as hard as they might. But I think given the fact that Vladimir Putin may see now that his initial tactics haven't worked, he may go in for a much bloodier campaign. And of course, there are Belarusian troops lined up along that southern border of Belarus, northern border of Ukraine, close to Kiev, who could be deployed at any moment. They haven't been sent in yet, but they might. And I think this is possibly just the beginning, and we haven't seen the worst of it yet. We did hear overnight from the regional governor of a town quite near to Kharkiv, near Sumy also, where we've seen some vigorous fighting, Okhturka, that 70 Ukrainian servicemen had been killed, a huge loss of life. And the Ukrainian parliament today tweeted, eternal glory to the heroes of Ukraine. And in my report, I talked about the fact that President Zelensky has asked for EU accession. He's also asked for there to be a no-fly zone over the skies of Ukraine. I wonder whether the EU will do what will definitely be a very, very provocative move for Vladimir Putin. And the US has already said that they don't want to implement a no-fly zone, or that they're very cautious about it because they don't want to deploy US troops to implement it and put themselves in a situation where you have the US facing off against Russian troops, because that could escalate things further. And that, I think, is the real danger for the West as they pour more and more supply weapons into Kiev and into Ukraine to make sure that this does not escalate into a war of NATO against Russia, because that could make things even worse than they already are.
Right, and on sanctions, tough sanctions now, swinging sanctions. Any sign at all that that is going to deter or dissuade Putin from what he wants to do?
Not from his rhetoric. Yesterday, he called an emergency economic meeting to discuss the sanctions and railed against the West, who he called the empire of lies. And the sanctions are coming in thick and fast. Japan today sanctioned all of the top administration, including Vladimir Putin. I think that he did not anticipate such a united response, despite the fact he was told over and over again that should he invade Ukraine, the West would come down with very, very strong sanctions. I imagine he did not anticipate that the Central Bank of Russia would have its assets frozen, because it has huge foreign currency reserves held abroad. And the US has frozen them. Other countries are expected to follow suit. That means that it will be very difficult for the central bank to sell off those reserves and prop up the ruble. We saw the ruble lose 32% at one point in yesterday's trade. It's now back a bit. I think this is just the beginning. When you talk to economists here, when you also talk to people here who are against this war, and that's not everybody, but there are a large, substantial chunk of people who are against it, they feel that this is going to set the Russian people back decades, that they are going to be 20 years behind the rest of the world, as they don't have the parts that they need for technologies, for aeroplanes, for smartphones, for tablets, for games. They won't be able to pay for imported goods because prices will go up substantially, inflation will go up. You know, they've had currency shocks before, back in the 90s, and I think people are very scared that they are going to see something like that coming soon. The question is, what impact will that have for Vladimir Putin? Will it consolidate the regime? Will it uproot the regime? And although there are a lot of theories about what might happen, I think it's really impossible to say.
I think it is. Diana, thank you very much for that. Well, let's take a closer look at how this situation in Ukraine has developed. Well, blasts and gunfire were heard here in the capital, in Brovary, on the outskirts of the city. An airstrike left a military airbase on fire. There were also reports of Russian forces shelling Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, some hitting residential areas. As for this morning, there are reports that more than 70 Ukrainian soldiers, as Diana was saying, have been killed after Russian artillery hit a military base around 60 miles away in the city of Otryak. That's according to the region's governor. Videos have been released showing damage to the northern city of Chernihiv. Ukraine's emergency ministry claims shelling hit a residential building there, a market building, a kindergarten, and to Mariupol in the south, a port city and a major Russian target. President Zelensky has said it is still hanging on and it is still under Ukrainian control. Sky's Alex Rossi joins me now from Dnipro in southeastern Ukraine. Good morning, Alex. And I mean, the reports from Kharkiv and other areas in the east suggest that there is intense shelling and intense bombing going on there.
I think that's right, Mark. It has been a grim morning here in Dnipro. People have been waking up to the sound of air raid sirens. They've stopped now, but it saw them running really for cover in the bomb shelters. There don't appear to have been any strikes here, but there is a sense we are kind of in the central eastern part of the country on the Dnipro River. There is a sense that the war is coming very close to here. But the focus of those attacks at the moment seems to be in terms of where I am, on that eastern second city of Kharkiv. Absolutely atrocious stories coming out of there overnight. And from yesterday, Human Rights Watch says it's almost certain that cluster munitions have been used indiscriminately on residential areas. Now, according to the mayor of Kharkiv, at least 9 civilians have been killed. More than 40 have been injured. But of course, that number could rise. It could rise a lot because people can't get into those areas at the moment. I think the more worrying sign, though, is that this is perhaps a signal that Vladimir Putin is changing the tempo of this military invasion. Now, anybody who has seen Russian wars over the last 15 years will be extremely concerned. I've seen for my own eyes what the Russian Air Force has done in Aleppo and Syria. Mass bombing of civilian areas, terrorizing those areas to try and break the will of the people. I've also seen what Russian forces did in Grozny in Chechnya. They literally kind of leveled cities. So that's the big fear. And we are seeing more use of artillery now, more use of rocket fire, and we're seeing the ensuing loss of civilian lives as well. Now, President Zelensky is calling for the international community to galvanize and organize a tribunal of what he says are very clear Russian war crimes. We wait to see what happens with that. But certainly the resistance from the Ukrainians, that still remains extremely fierce and extremely strong. We've driven south out of here. We've seen them digging in for, what will be a very big fight when the Russian armor comes up from the south. In terms of the south, the target you mentioned there of Mariupol, well, I think the net of force is closing around that. My contacts there are telling me that the city is pretty much surrounded. There's been quite heavy shelling. There's sounds of small arms fire as well in the city. And then I think what you will see is columns of armor moving up from the south when the Russians believe that they control that. There will, of course, be Ukrainian resistance behind those lines and pushing from Donetsk as well to where we are to try and gain this sort of central area of the eastern part of the country. But, people here are very worried and very scared about where this is going.
Yeah, and Alex, we were in Kharkiv broadcasting last week, and speaking to the people there, they said they would not accept Russian control. They wouldn't accept Russian troops in their city, and they wouldn't accept Putin determining, how they lived. Is that kind of spirit still there, or do you get a sense the resolve is weakening with every missile that comes in?
No, I think that strength is very much still there. People are coming into this country to fight against the Russians. Large numbers of people have left, older people, women, children, about 500,000 so far, but that number's rising rapidly. But the resolve of the Ukrainians is absolutely immense. And I think it's quite clear from their tactics that they haven't tried to defend open areas of countryside, because quite honestly, against the sheer power and mass of Russian armor, that would be an impossible task. But they are digging in. I mean, in lots and lots of towns between here and Mariupol, I have seen them moving into areas. I won't go into too much detail for obvious reasons, but moving into areas which could see this descend very quickly into a guerrilla battle. The other thing that's very interesting as well, we've now seen quite a few videos that have been put out. Not all of them, of course, have been verified. These are of captured Russian soldiers. These are of phone messages that they've left where they believed, these are young kids, these are conscripts who believed that they were coming in here in a glorious mission of peacekeeping. Now, they haven't been coming here as peacekeepers, we know that, and they've certainly been disabused of that view, being met by anti-tank weapons, being met by artillery, civilians standing in the way of columns of armor. So I think if the Ukrainians can hold on and not lose, the Russians can't win, if that makes sense. I think the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that whilst I think in most people's minds there's no doubt that Vladimir Putin can win this battle, how do you win the war afterwards, i.e. the peace? I mean, the hatred in this country for Vladimir Putin and the Russian invaders, you can't overstate it. And that perhaps is the Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian people's most powerful weapon at the moment, harnessing the power of that emotion.
All right, Alex Rossi there in Dnipro. Thank you very much indeed. Let's speak now to Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary Dominic Raab. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Let's just work out where we are here. There's a 40-mile column of Putin's armor just outside this capital, about to lay siege to Kiev, capital of a free democratic country, and the West is not going to stop him. How does that sit with you?
Well, I'm not sure I'd accept that characterization. First of all, we pay tribute to the heroic defense.
Which bit of the characterization? Which bit?
Allow me to explain.
That they're there, or that the West is going to stop them?
Can I give the answer, and then you can pick up on any aspect of it? Sure. First of all, we do pay tribute to the heroic defense by the Ukrainian forces and their fortitude in the face of outright aggression from President Putin. Our view as the UK is that Putin's mission in Ukraine must fail. I don't think it's right to say that we've done nothing to stop or curtail what Putin is doing. I think if you look at not just the suite of sanctions on oligarchs and on banks and on the Russian state, but also the impact that the collective action has had, including on the central bank and on the SWIFT payment system. We've seen the biggest fall in the ruble against the dollar. We've seen the stock market in Russia fall to record lows, and the central bank in Russia have to double interest rates. And that is all part of the allied, if you like, the UK working with our international partners' efforts to starve Putin's war machine. And it does have an impact. And of course, as your correspondent...
Just with respect, Mr. Raab, I didn't say you were doing nothing to stop him. I said you were not going to stop him. He is going to surround this capital, lay siege to this capital. And I asked you how it sat with you that that could happen. NATO has the most powerful air force in the world, and this is happening in a European capital in 2022.
Well, of course, Ukraine's not a member of NATO. We've been clear about that in terms of military participation. But what we have done is arm something like 20,000 Ukrainian troops. We've sent 2,000 anti-tank missiles. We've provided a package of support, £100 million. And of course, allies and partners have done further support. We yesterday announced 40 million additional in humanitarian assistance. So we are, along with the sanctions suite. So, and it has had an impact in the way I described on Putin. But we know that Putin will react to this, or we fear that Putin will react to this with even more barbaric tactics. And that's why we need to be prepared that this could be a long haul, and we will do everything we can to achieve our goals of making Putin fail.
You seem to be saying, but you seem to be saying that there's less of a moral case, there's less of a humanitarian case, there's less of an urgent case because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Isn't a humanitarian case and a moral case absolutely urgent now? And does it matter really that it's not a matter of NATO, it's not a member of NATO?
I think the NATO is incredibly relevant in terms of how we apply the principle of collective self-defense. Of course it is. But what you're right to say is that morally, we feel a strong duty to do everything we can to degrade Putin's war machine, hence the sanctions. I've described the impact they're having. Also, the efforts we're taking to support and steel the resolve and the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians, which we've done in the way I described. On top of that, the humanitarian support. And we're working with our international partners. I think it's been a pretty clear and concerted response.
Yes, but your argument, Mr. Raab, your argument seems to be that, you know, the argument for not acting is that it could start another world war or, heaven forbid, some sort of nuclear war. Well, then what is to stop President Putin going on to attack other countries, just using the same nuclear threat, even countries that are members of NATO?
Well, what is to stop him is this is turning into a much, much more perilous misadventure for Putin than I think he realized. And as your report made clear, it has had a demoralizing effect on Russian forces, some of those young conscripts, and it has had the effect of stealing the will of the Ukrainian people. And that is how we will ensure Putin fails in Ukraine. And we're there for the long haul. And that's why, I mean, again, with some of these very brutal tactics that we're seeing being reported, including by Sky News, with the harrowing pictures that we will see in our TV screens and in the newspapers, I think we've been very clear that those that engage in war crimes will be held to account. And the ICC prosecutors already...
That's absolutely it. There are war crimes happening right now in this country. Children are dying, schools are being attacked, a kindergarten has been attacked, and the West is sanctioning Russian banks and kicking Russia out of the World Cup.
Yes, and but no, more than that, actually. I mean, I totally accept what you're saying. This is the barbarous consequences of such an appalling, aggressive action by President Putin.
Which you're not managing to stop, which you're not stopping.
So forgive me, you're interrupting me at every step, and you're frankly following this on the 24-hour news cycle, which I understand is you're at liberty to do. What we've said we're going to do is degrade Putin's war machine by starving it of the finance necessary to operate. And actually, if you look at the short-term consequences, the effect on the ruble, the effect on the stock market, the doubling of interest rates in Russia, it is having the effect that we want, and it is turning into a very, very difficult campaign for Putin, one which, and we've always said this will be disastrous for Russian for Putin and for the Russian people. But I do think we'll need to have the stamina to be in this for the long haul. And that's why making it clear, both to Putin, but also to commanders in Moscow, on the ground in Ukraine, that they will be held accountable for any violations of the laws of war. And we've shown, the West has shown that we're willing to see this through. We will not just look the other way. We had Radovan Karadzic, the butcher of the Balkans, end up in a British jail cell via The Hague recently. And that message will go to those commanders on the ground in Moscow, as well as back to in Ukraine, as well as back to Moscow. And there will be accountability for any crimes that are committed on Ukrainian soil.
And for Vladimir Putin, accountability for Vladimir Putin when it comes to war crimes?
Well, that is there as well. He is ultimately the person in charge via command responsibility. And so that is very much a factor. And this ought to play into his calculations, along with the fact that, as your reporter quite rightly said, and your clip quite rightly said, this has not been the walk in the park that he expected, either in terms of Ukrainian resistance or the effectiveness of his own tactics. So all of these things will slow down, and we hope encourage, change the calculus and get him to step back. Again, we take these actions, and the UK has done a huge amount. It's been in the vanguard, the Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary, the Foreign Secretary. But we do this with our partners, and we're willing to be in this for the long haul, because I suspect, notwithstanding the initial stuttering, Putin will respond and seek to respond in ever more heavy-handed ways with the appalling humanitarian consequences that will have.
So what about the idea of enforcing some sort of no-fly zone, some sort of humanitarian corridor? Would you support trying to enforce a no-fly zone here?
I think the Defence Secretary has already been clear on that. We're not going to do that, because it will put us in a position where we would have to enforce it by, in effect, shooting down Russian planes. What we are doing is the measures that I described to you on sanctions, on supporting the Ukrainian resistance, and on the accountability piece, which I think will be even more important. And we'll hear more about that in the days and weeks ahead.
How long does British intelligence think that Kiev, the capital city here, can hold out?
Well, I'm not going to comment directly on the intelligence we get, but it's very difficult to say. The Russian initial advance has been slowed down more than they expected, and that is a testament to the Ukrainian fortitude and courage. And what we want to do is do everything we can to delay the fall of Kiev or any of the other major cities in Ukraine. And we will continue to look with our allies at every means of achieving that, so to make sure that Putin fails in Ukraine. It's critically important. That's our strategic objective.
Okay, well, I mean, I suppose if he takes Kiev, he gets rid of the government, he occupies this country, I suppose he'll consider that he hasn't failed. But are we being a bit mean-spirited on visas, do you think? I wonder, a 75-year-old woman living now in a basement in the capital here, who has her son living in London, can she go and join him?
So just on your first point, you know, if Putin occupies Kiev and one or other of the major cities, that doesn't mean this is over, because I think what you'll see is Ukrainians bedding down for some form of guerrilla challenge, which will take a lot longer and could well be unresolvable from the point of view of Putin's military objectives. And indeed, your clip showed that. In terms of the question of visas and Ukrainians, the Home Secretary has set out the plans for a bespoke humanitarian scheme for Ukraine, allowing up to 100,000 to come here. The dependence of British nationals in the UK, the dependence of Ukrainians living in this country. And I think that's the right way to approach. And it follows the wider action.
But how does the 75-year-old woman, sorry to interrupt you, but how does the sirens just going off here, but how does the 75-year-old woman living with sirens going off, living in a basement, get to her son who's living in London? Can she do that? Is she able to do that? Because I can't see how she does. How does she go to Lviv, 11 hours drive away, get a visa, and then, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I don't see how she can get to her son in London under the current system.
Well, this is a consistent feature whenever we have humanitarian asylum schemes set up. We know that the difficulties on the ground make it practically very challenging, but we also know that many will get out of Ukraine, those that fleeing through fear, and we need to be ready with our international partners, the Europeans, others around the world.
The EU is saying any Ukrainian can come in. Any Ukrainian can come in for up to 3 years, or certainly extended family members other countries are doing. Why are we not doing more? I mean, that
we've set out.
My point about the 75-year-old woman is a real one.
Yes, but I can't comment on every potential hypothetical case. What I've just set out is the circumstances. And of course, we understand the difficulties of the practical situation on the ground. That's common to most conflict zones, of course. And we recognise that, and we'll work with all of our international partners and the UN to try and resolve that, and to make sure that we continue this tradition of offering safe haven to those fleeing persecution. In relation to the Europeans, of course, they're closer to Ukraine. And as the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK said over the weekend, it will often be the case that first priority, most Ukrainians want to stay in Ukraine, but if they leave, they'll want to be as close to their home country as possible in order to be able to come back at some point in the future. So I think
this woman wants to get to see her son in London, but you know, I mean, she doesn't want to go to Poland and stay in Poland. She wants to go and see her son in London.
Sorry, I don't know the facts of the case, but it's clear from what the Home Secretary announced yesterday that we would make that route technically open. Of course, it's very difficult to know how exactly she would traverse the country at that age, but that is the offer the Home Secretary has made. So actually, it directly addresses the scenario you've described.
Okay, Dominic Raab, I appreciate you being with us. We're being slightly distracted here by sirens, but listen, I appreciate your talking to us this morning.
Good to talk to you.
Okay, we've just got some pictures we can show you now, not from this city, but from Kharkiv over in the east. It shows a pretty large explosion. And in fact, I know that building. That building is in Freedom Square in the center of Kharkiv, where we were last week. And in fact, you can see some tents in front of it in the Ukrainian colors. Now, that is a stop the war kind of permanent demonstration. And behind it is the local authority building that is now covered in smoke, you can see there. And that is a missile attack direct on that building in the center of Kharkiv. Those pictures just coming in to Sky News. Well, our political correspondent Tamara Cohen joins us live now from Westminster. And Tamara, what did you make of what Dominic Raab had to say?
Morning, Mark. Well, you know on the ground there how urgent the situation is for the people who are holding out in Kiev. But the message very much from the UK government and indeed from the White House yesterday is that military support in the shape of a no-fly zone or other military support directly to Ukraine is not going to happen. The White House made very clear yesterday that would constitute basically a full-scale war between NATO and Russia. Boris Johnson made the same point when he was asked about it by Ukrainians in London on Sunday. And so Dominic Raab said, the best hope we've got is to try and starve the Russian war machine financially. That is the way the UK feels is the best way to make Putin fail, while also shoring up the states around him. And we know Boris Johnson is travelling today to Poland and to see some British troops in Estonia on the border with Russia to see how they are propping up that NATO eastern flank. But certainly any military support in the shape of a no-fly zone directly to Ukraine is not going to be carried out. And so therefore sanctions, and there have been some very severe sanctions, and the government is planning for more of those close this week. We know they're planning more restrictions on Russian banks operating in London, for example. We may hear more about that today. On the big question also of what Ukrainian refugees pouring over the border to Poland at the moment might be able to do in terms of coming and reuniting with relatives in London, the government is still yet to set out exactly how the scheme is going to work. Dominic Raab said, refugee situations occur in every war, but certainly if you contrast that with what the EU are doing, they've announced they're going to waive visa rules for Ukrainians coming to EU countries. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure here for the government to change its policy.
Okay, Tamara, thank you very much indeed. And the United Nations says more than 500,000 people have now fled Ukraine for neighboring countries, mainly Poland, since the start of Russia's invasion. The numbers crossing into the countries are growing, well, by the hour. 281,000 people have entered Poland. More than 84,000 have made it to Hungary. About 36,000 on the border with Moldova. More than 32,000 in Romania, and around 30,000 heading towards Slovakia. The UN says that the remainder have been dispersed among various different countries. Our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons reports now from Milny. In fact, we can't get that report, I understand. We can go to Alistair Bunkle, who I think is in Geneva, is he? Good morning. Alistair, good morning. Yeah, and a meeting there, Liz Truss heading there. Alistair, what can we expect from the talks?
Well, look, firstly, Mark, I think probably something along the lines of what you were just saying about the refugee crisis, because that is clearly something that is growing by the day as well, and Europe will need to come together to work out a coordinated response to that, given that it is impacting so many borders and so many tens of thousands of Ukrainians now. So I'm sure that they will be trying to seek some sort of united humanitarian support for that, and some sort of coordinated asylum response as well. Yeah, Liz Truss does come here. She's on her way to the United Nations. It is a somewhat pared down gathering. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, will address it remotely, but he won't be here in person. Neither will Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. He says because of the ban on Russian aircraft in European airspace, he's not going to be able to come. And so what that does is it removes perhaps the prospect that some people were hoping for, that the two foreign ministers of the United States and Russia would be able to get together behind the scenes and, who knows, maybe find some sort of breakthrough. Instead, Liz Truss will come here. The words that the Foreign Office have released ahead of it are pretty strong. She will say that Russian tanks are tearing through towns while missiles barrage homes and hospitals. Putin is murdering Ukrainians indiscriminately, she will say. She will also have bilateral meetings with her Canadian, Danish, Czech counterparts. And I guess they will talk about what further sanctions can be levied. But, it is hard. It's hard to think what more. Yes, OK, I'm sure they can go further. But there has already been a very united, very coordinated, very strong response from the United Nations, from the European Union countries, from Britain, from the United States. And yet, as we were seeing this morning, President Putin and his military only step up the assault on Ukraine. I think they might look towards Belarus as well and levying sanctions against Belarus that mirror those against Russia. But clearly, despite playing a very strong hand with sanctions, it doesn't seem to be stopping Vladimir Putin, at least in the short term.
No, it doesn't. Alistair, thank you very much. Don't forget, every day this week we'll have a special program twice a day on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'll bring you everything, all the latest about what's happening here, right across the country, as well as correspondents across the world, Washington, Westminster, all over Europe. That's Ukraine invasion at 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. all this week. Joining me now is the former head of counter-terror at the Ministry of Defence, Major Chip Chapman. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. So we've got this 40-mile column outside this capital city. What do you expect the plan to be here?
about X targets have been hit or the Russians are behind their timeline are irrelevant. So what you're going to see now is the sequencing of tactical battles for the operational objectives being achieved, and I think we'll see Kiev being encircled, and you'll have an escalation, because an escalation that's both in target sets and fires, more targets destroyed, and jus in bello will be broken. That is, that the targeting will be against legitimacy, proportionality, necessity, and distinction in war. So they should be held accountable for that. So we're going to see greater combat power brought to bear. And it's worth saying that on D+2, the third day, they only had used a third of their combat power, 50% by D+3, and now they're going to use 75%. So the mass that the Russians will bring to bear is the thing which will be crucial in the next 1 or 2 days. So the resistance is remarkable, but ultimately mass may prevail. You can break the will of an enemy ultimately, because it's not just armed forces that fight wars, it's nations that fight wars.
Yeah, I mean, what do you make of the Ukrainian resistance in terms of their military? They are surprisingly well equipped, given the sort of resources that are coming in here. But what have you made of how the Ukrainian military are performing?
Well, we talk about fighting power in 3 parts. The moral one, they've been absolutely remarkable, but they're fighting for families, country, independence, and sovereignty. In the way they fought, they've also been very clever. They've been surviving through movement, deception, dispersion, and massing when they need to try and chew some of these columns. And I think interdicting that 40-mile column by drone strikes or something like that is absolutely crucial today. You could have a sort of Mittler pass from the Iraq War sort of thing. The last thing is that the physical part of fighting power, and they're being well equipped with sort of the Stingers and anti-tank missiles. But one of the fears is that you could have a 4th front, I think, and that is a northern grouping, probably out of Belarus, to try and cut those supply lines that are coming in with these supplies from NATO countries. And of course, it's worth saying that there are 3 Russian axes at the moment. The central grouping, which is towards Kiev, which we've heard a lot about. But you've also got these western groupings and southern groupings, which have actually been slightly more successful, because a lot of these operations are envelopment operations or encirclement operations, not actually fighting in the cities. And certainly from American intelligence, they're suggesting at the moment that they're trying to draw a line between Mariupol in the Black Sea up to Kharkov, and then they will hold that, and that will become de facto Ukrainian territory. Now, that will try to be negotiated away should there be a ceasefire, but what you have, you hold, you have generally in military doctrine.
Yeah, you mean de facto Russian territory as opposed to Ukrainian territory? I mean, that's what he's trying to do, do you think? He's trying